Part 1. Early Life and Athenian Context. Socrates, one of the most renowned philosophers in Western history, was born in 470 BCE in the Athenian deme of Alapis. Athens at the time was a bustling, cosmopolitan city, experiencing the peak of its intellectual and cultural influence under the leadership of Pericles. The son of Sophroniscus, a stonemason, and Phaenarete, a midwife, Socrates came from a modest background, and little is known about his early life, though his family likely expected him to follow in his father's footsteps as a craftsman. Despite the limited financial resources of his family, Socrates lived in a city that was the heart of Greek education and culture, a place where young boys were trained in music, physical exercise, literature, and the basics of philosophy. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a direct democracy, unique in its governance and political influence. Every male citizen had a say in the decisions of the state, making it a city where public debate was not only encouraged but necessary. The intellectual environment of Athens was saturated with discussions about politics, philosophy, and the nature of life itself, and it was in this city that Socrates would come to develop his unique approach to understanding the world and the role of human beings within it. Growing up in this vibrant intellectual setting, Socrates would have been exposed to a wide variety of thinkers and ideas. Parmenides and Heraclitus, for instance, were major figures in Greek philosophy at the time, and their work laid the foundation for much of the thought that Socrates would later engage with. Parmenides, who argued for the unchanging nature of reality, and Heraclitus, who emphasized constant flux and change, both posed philosophical challenges that Socrates would address in his own way. Additionally, the sophists were becoming increasingly popular during Socrates' youth. These traveling teachers claimed to offer wisdom and rhetorical skill for a price, teaching young men how to speak persuasively in public debates and legal disputes. The sophists, who believed that truth was relative and that skilled rhetoric could make any argument convincing, would become one of Socrates' main intellectual adversaries as he matured. However, at this early stage in his life, Socrates was not yet known for his critical engagements with other thinkers. Instead, he was still absorbing the rich intellectual traditions of his city. Socrates' formal education would likely have included lessons in music, gymnastics, and the study of epic poetry, particularly the works of Homer, which were essential to the education of young Athenians. Through these early studies, Socrates would have become familiar with the Greek heroic tradition, which emphasized honor, courage, and the importance of reputation. This heroic ethic, however, would come to be one of the things that Socrates later questioned in his dialogues, as he shifted the focus from external achievements to internal moral development. Despite the cultural richness of Athens, the city was not without its problems. The Peloponnesian War, which broke out in 431 BCE between Athens and Sparta, profoundly shaped the political landscape during Socrates' lifetime. The war would last for nearly 30 years, causing economic hardship and social upheaval. Socrates, like many Athenian men of his time, served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier, in several military campaigns during the war. His service in the Athenian army at the battles of Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis is one of the few biographical details that we know about his early adulthood. His experiences in the war likely had a significant impact on his thinking about the nature of courage, justice, and the role of the individual in society. Athens itself was undergoing dramatic changes during this period. Under the leadership of Pericles, the city had embarked on an ambitious building program that included the construction of the Parthenon and other monumental structures on the Acropolis. The city became the cultural and intellectual center of the Greek world, attracting thinkers, artists, and writers from across the Mediterranean. But as Athens' power and wealth grew, so did the tensions within its society. The Peloponnesian War exacerbated these internal divisions, and by the end of the war in 404 BCE, Athens was a city in crisis, having suffered both military defeat and internal strife. It was against this backdrop of war, political instability, and intellectual ferment that Socrates began to develop his own philosophical ideas. However, unlike other philosophers of his time, Socrates did not write down his teachings, nor did he establish a formal school. Instead, he engaged in conversations with his fellow citizens, questioning them about their beliefs, values, and assumptions. These conversations, which often took place in the marketplace or other public spaces, were not always well received. Socrates' method of questioning, which involved exposing contradictions in his interlocutor's beliefs, earned him many enemies, particularly among the powerful elites of Athens. Socrates' decision to focus his philosophical inquiry on ethical questions rather than on the natural world also set him apart from other thinkers of his time. While many pre-Socratic philosophers were concerned with understanding the nature of the cosmos, Socrates believed that the most important questions were those that dealt with human life and how one ought to live. This shift in focus from cosmology to ethics was one of Socrates' most significant contributions to Western philosophy, and it laid the foundation for later philosophical movements, including the schools of Plato and Aristotle. Moreover, Socrates' emphasis on self-examination and moral development reflected the changing social and political landscape of Athens. As the city became more democratic, the importance of individual responsibility and ethical decision-making became more pronounced. Socrates challenged his fellow citizens to think critically about their own lives and to question the traditional values that had shaped Athenian society for centuries. This challenge was not always welcome, especially in a city that was already facing political and social instability. Socrates' early life and the intellectual context in which he developed his ideas were crucial to the formation of his philosophy. Growing up in a city that valued debate and intellectual inquiry, Socrates was exposed to a wide range of ideas and thinkers, from the relativism of the sophists to the metaphysical speculations of Parmenides and Heraclitus. His experiences in the Peloponnesian War, as well as the political turmoil of Athens during this period, likely shaped his thinking about the nature of justice, courage, and the role of the individual in society. And yet, despite the rich intellectual tradition of his city, Socrates would come to challenge many of the accepted beliefs of his time, developing a new approach to philosophy that focused on ethical questions and the importance of self-examination. As Socrates matured and began to engage more directly with the intellectual life of Athens, his method of inquiry, known as the Socratic method, would come to define his approach to philosophy. But at this early stage in his life, Socrates was still a student of his city, absorbing the ideas and traditions that would later become the foundation for his own philosophical contributions. His humble beginnings, military service, and immersion in the intellectual culture of Athens all played a role in shaping the thinker who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. Part 2. Athenian Democracy and Socratic Thought. Socrates lived in one of the most remarkable cities of the ancient world, Athens during its Golden Age, a period defined by great artistic, cultural, and political achievements. However, despite the democratic principles that Athens was famous for, Socrates found himself at odds with many aspects of Athenian life, particularly its politics. His critique of Athenian democracy and his philosophical investigations into ethics, justice, and governance offer profound insights into both his character and the challenges of the time. Athens' system of direct democracy was revolutionary for its time. Male citizens were allowed to participate in the assembly, where they could propose laws, debate public policy, and influence decisions that affected the entire city-state. In theory, this allowed Athens to be governed by the will of its people, with decisions made collectively rather than by a monarch or oligarchy. The system was deeply participatory, with major legal cases, public offices, and military commands all being decided by lot or popular vote. However, for Socrates, this democratic system was deeply flawed, and his criticisms of it reveal much about his broader philosophical ideas. Socrates was not opposed to the concept of democracy per se, but he took issue with how it was practiced in Athens. For him, governance should be based on knowledge and wisdom, not on the whims of the majority or the skillful rhetoric of persuasive speakers. One of Socrates' key objections to democracy was that it placed power in the hands of the uninformed masses, who were susceptible to being swayed by emotion rather than reason. He argued that most people did not have the knowledge or training to make sound decisions on complex matters of state, and that governance should be left to those who were truly wise and virtuous. This belief put Socrates in direct opposition to the Sophists, a group of traveling teachers and intellectuals who were highly influential in Athens. The Sophists taught that truth was relative, and that effective rhetoric could persuade anyone of anything, regardless of its actual merit. They focused on teaching young men how to speak convincingly and win debates, often for a fee. To Socrates, this represented the antithesis of what philosophy should be. He believed that philosophy was not about winning arguments or gaining power, but about seeking truth and understanding. The Sophists' emphasis on rhetoric over substance was, in Socrates' view, one of the major dangers of Athenian democracy. The tension between Socratic thought and Athenian democracy is perhaps most clearly illustrated in his analogy of the ship of state. In this metaphor, Socrates compares the city-state to a ship at sea. Just as a ship requires a skilled captain to navigate it through dangerous waters, so too does the state require wise leaders to guide it through the complexities of governance. However, in a democracy, the masses often elect leaders based on popularity rather than competence, just as a ship's crew might choose a captain who is charismatic but knows nothing about navigation. For Socrates, this was the central flaw of democracy. It equated popularity with wisdom, leading to poor governance and the eventual decline of the state. Socrates also critiqued the way that Athenian democracy allowed for the manipulation of public opinion. In a system where public speakers could sway the assembly with their words, skilled orators held an outsized influence over the decision-making process. Socrates believed that these orators often used rhetoric to manipulate the emotions of the people, rather than appealing to reason and justice. The result was a political system in which decisions were made not based on what was best for the city, but on what was most popular or expedient at the time. This critique of democracy was not merely theoretical for Socrates. He lived through a period of great political instability in Athens, particularly during and after the Peloponnesian War. Athens' defeat at the hands of Sparta in 404 BCE marked the end of its golden age and ushered in a period of oligarchic rule under the 30 tyrants. This short-lived regime, which was supported by Sparta, engaged in widespread political purges and executions, leading to great suffering in the city. Socrates, however, refused to participate in the injustices perpetrated by the 30 tyrants, even at great personal risk. His refusal to comply with an illegal order to arrest an innocent man demonstrated his commitment to his principles, regardless of the political consequences. After the fall of the 30 tyrants, democracy was restored in Athens, but the city was deeply divided, and its political system remained fragile. It was in this context that Socrates continued his philosophical work, engaging his fellow citizens in dialogues about justice, virtue, and the role of the individual in the state. However, his persistent questioning of authority and his critique of Athenian democracy earned him many enemies, particularly among the city's elites. His association with controversial figures, such as Alcibiades and Critias, both of whom played significant roles in Athenian politics, further contributed to his unpopularity. Alcibiades, a brilliant but erratic general, was blamed for many of Athens' military failures, while Critias became one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants. Socrates' relationship with these figures was complex. While he engaged in philosophical discussions with them, he did not condone their actions or political ambitions. In fact, Socrates was critical of those who sought power for its own sake, believing that true leadership required wisdom and virtue. His unwillingness to flatter the powerful or to participate in the political machinations of the time further alienated him from the ruling class. Socrates' insistence on questioning everything, including the foundations of Athenian democracy, made him a dangerous figure in the eyes of many. One of Socrates' most famous students, Plato, would later expand on his teacher's critique of democracy in works such as The Republic. In this dialogue, Plato presents a vision of an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, wise rulers who possess the knowledge and virtue necessary to lead the city justly. This idea, which was heavily influenced by Socrates' thought, stands in stark contrast to the democratic system of Athens, where power was distributed among the many rather than concentrated in the hands of the few. Plato's critique of democracy, like Socrates, was grounded in the belief that most people lack the wisdom and knowledge to make sound political decisions. Socrates' opposition to the uncritical acceptance of democratic values extended to his views on justice and the role of the individual in society. He believed that justice was not simply a matter of following the laws or doing what was most popular, but of adhering to a higher moral standard. For Socrates, the well-being of the individual was intimately connected to the well-being of the city, and true justice could only be achieved when individuals acted in accordance with virtue and reason. This idea of justice as a personal, internal quality was one of Socrates' major contributions to Western thought and would later be developed by Plato and other philosophers. Despite his criticisms of Athenian democracy, Socrates was deeply committed to his city. He served in the military, participated in public debates, and even stood trial when accused of corrupting the youth and introducing new guards. His commitment to Athens, however, did not prevent him from questioning its most fundamental institutions. For Socrates, philosophy was not about accepting the status quo, but about constantly challenging assumptions and seeking the truth. This approach often put him at odds with his fellow citizens, but it also made him one of the most influential thinkers in Western history. In conclusion, Socrates' relationship with Athenian democracy was complex and multifaceted. While he valued the participation of individuals in the governance of the state, he also believed that true leadership required wisdom and virtue, qualities that were often lacking in the Athenian political system. His critique of democracy, particularly its susceptibility to manipulation by skilled orators and its tendency to equate popularity with wisdom, remains relevant to contemporary political discourse. Socrates' insistence on the importance of reason, virtue, and self-examination continues to influence modern democratic thought, even as it challenges some of its most basic assumptions. Part 3. Philosophical Method and the Socratic Question. One of Socrates' most lasting contributions to Western philosophy is his method of inquiry, commonly referred to as the Socratic method. This technique, which focuses on asking and answering questions to stimulate critical thinking and illuminate ideas, was revolutionary in its simplicity and power. The Socratic method remains one of the most influential pedagogical tools, used today not only in philosophy but also in law, education, and various fields where critical thinking is essential. However, the method was much more than a tool for teaching. For Socrates, it was a way of life, a way of engaging with the world to seek out truth, wisdom, and virtue. The Socratic method, also known as elenchus, is a dialectical form of debate that seeks to expose contradictions in a person's beliefs by asking a series of probing questions. Socrates would engage in dialogues with a wide range of Athenians, from politicians and poets to craftsmen and ordinary citizens, often beginning with a seemingly simple question like, "What is justice?" or "What is virtue?" The aim of the conversation was not to win an argument, but to arrive at a deeper understanding of the topic at hand. One of the central features of the Socratic method is that it does not provide definitive answers. Instead, it encourages participants to reflect on their assumptions, challenge their beliefs, and recognize the limits of their knowledge. For Socrates, the starting point of wisdom was recognizing one's own ignorance. This idea is encapsulated in one of his most famous sayings, "I know that I know nothing." While this statement might seem paradoxical, it reflects Socrates' belief that true wisdom begins with an awareness of one's limitations. The Socratic method typically begins with Socrates posing a question to his interlocutor. For example, in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates asks Euthyphro to define piety. Euthyphro offers a series of definitions, each of which Socrates questions and refutes, eventually leading Euthyphro to admit that he does not actually know what piety is. This process of questioning, refutation, and reflection is at the heart of the Socratic method. The aim is not to embarrass the interlocutor or to prove them wrong, but to help them recognize their own ignorance and inspire them to seek greater understanding. In Euthyphro and many other Socratic dialogues, the process of questioning often ends in what is known as aporia, or puzzlement. The interlocutor is left without a clear answer to the question, but with a heightened awareness of the complexity of the issue. For Socrates, this state of aporia was not a failure, but a crucial step in the pursuit of wisdom. By dismantling false beliefs and assumptions, Socrates believed that individuals could begin to construct a more accurate understanding of the world and of themselves. The Socratic method stands in stark contrast to the teaching techniques of the sophists, who were Socrates' intellectual rivals. The sophists were known for teaching rhetoric and persuasion, often for a fee, and were skilled at making any argument appear convincing, regardless of its truth. For them, the goal of a debate was not to arrive at the truth, but to win the argument. Socrates, on the other hand, was concerned with the pursuit of truth and understanding, even if it meant admitting one's own ignorance. One of the key elements of the Socratic method is that it treats philosophy as a social activity. For Socrates, philosophy was not something to be done in isolation, but in conversation with others. He believed that through dialogue, individuals could challenge each other's beliefs, sharpen their reasoning, and ultimately move closer to the truth. This idea of philosophy as a communal activity has had a profound influence on the development of Western thought, particularly in the works of Plato, who continued to use dialogue as a central form in his philosophical writings. Socrates' method also had a moral dimension. He believed that engaging in philosophical dialogue was essential for leading a virtuous life. The process of questioning and self-examination was, in his view, a way of purifying the soul and aligning one's actions with one's principles. For Socrates, the examined life was the only life worth living, and he encouraged his fellow citizens to engage in this process of reflection, even if it was uncomfortable or difficult. One of the most striking features of the Socratic method is that it often leads to more questions than answers. This open-ended approach to philosophy reflects Socrates' belief that the pursuit of wisdom is a lifelong journey, one that requires constant questioning and self-reflection. Unlike other philosophers who sought to provide definitive answers to metaphysical or ethical questions, Socrates was more interested in the process of inquiry itself. For him, philosophy was not about arriving at final conclusions, but about continually challenging oneself to think more deeply and critically. This relentless pursuit of truth through dialogue and questioning made Socrates a controversial figure in Athens. Many of his fellow citizens were not accustomed to being questioned about their beliefs, particularly in public settings. Socrates' method of exposing contradictions and ignorance in others' thinking was often seen as disrespectful or subversive, particularly when it involved prominent figures in Athenian society. His method also had a political dimension, as it challenged the status quo and questioned the legitimacy of those in power. Socrates' method did not merely expose intellectual shortcomings. It often led his interlocutors to confront the moral implications of their beliefs. In dialogues like Gorgias, Socrates engages with politicians and sophists to question their understanding of power, justice, and the good life. In doing so, he reveals that many of those in positions of authority have a shallow or misguided understanding of these important concepts. This kind of questioning was not just an intellectual exercise. It was a challenge to the very foundations of Athenian political and social life. The Socratic method also played a central role in Socrates' understanding of education. Unlike the sophists, who claimed to teach virtue and knowledge for a fee, Socrates believed that true knowledge could not be taught in the conventional sense. Instead, he saw himself as a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to their own understanding through questioning and dialogue. This idea of teaching as a process of self-discovery has had a lasting impact on educational theory, particularly in the works of philosophers like John Dewey, who emphasized experiential learning and critical thinking. Socrates' emphasis on dialogue and questioning also extended to his views on authority and expertise. In several of Plato's dialogues, Socrates engages with experts in various fields, politicians, poets, and craftsmen, to question their claims to knowledge. He often finds that while these individuals may have technical expertise in their respective fields, they lack a deeper understanding of virtue and the good life. For Socrates, true wisdom was not about having specialized knowledge, but about understanding how to live a good and just life. This critique of expertise is particularly relevant in the context of Athenian democracy, where public officials were often chosen by lot rather than by merit, and where skilled orators could sway the opinions of the masses regardless of their actual knowledge or expertise. Socrates' questioning of these experts was not an attack on their professions, but a challenge to the idea that technical skill or rhetorical ability equates to wisdom. His method of exposing the limits of others' knowledge was a way of encouraging humility and self-awareness, qualities that he believed were essential for both individuals and society as a whole. The Socratic method, with its emphasis on questioning, dialogue, and self-examination, remains one of the most important contributions that Socrates made to philosophy. It laid the foundation for the development of Western philosophical thought, influencing figures like Plato, Aristotle, and countless others. Its focus on critical thinking and the pursuit of truth has also had a lasting impact on education, law, and public discourse. Socrates' use of the method was not merely a philosophical exercise, but a way of living. He believed that through questioning and dialogue, individuals could achieve greater self-understanding and moral clarity. His insistence on the importance of self-examination and intellectual humility continues to resonate today, particularly in a world where certainty and dogma often prevail over critical thinking and open inquiry. In conclusion, the Socratic method is much more than a technique for winning debates or challenging others. It is a way of life, a method of engaging with the world that emphasizes humility, self-awareness, and the continuous pursuit of truth. Socrates' method of questioning remains a powerful tool for philosophical inquiry, and its legacy can be seen in every discipline that values critical thinking, dialogue, and the search for understanding. Through his method, Socrates left an indelible mark on Western thought, one that continues to shape how we think about knowledge, wisdom, and the good life. Part 4. Moral Philosophy, Virtue and Knowledge. Socrates' approach to moral philosophy fundamentally redefined how ethics was understood in ancient Greece and laid the groundwork for much of Western ethical thought. At the heart of his philosophy was the idea that knowledge and virtue are intimately connected, and that living a good life depends on understanding the true nature of virtue. This conviction drove much of Socrates' philosophical inquiry, as he believed that ignorance was the root of all moral failings. In this section, we will explore Socrates' ideas on virtue, his concept of the unity of virtues, and how he understood the relationship between knowledge and morality. One of the most striking aspects of Socratic moral philosophy is the idea that virtue is knowledge. For Socrates, to know what is good is to do what is good. In other words, if a person truly understands what is right, they will naturally act in accordance with that knowledge. Socrates rejected the idea that people knowingly do wrong or act against their own best interests. According to him, immoral behavior results from ignorance. Individuals commit wrongful acts because they do not truly know what is good or right. This position stands in contrast to more common views of morality, which often recognize a struggle between knowledge of the good and the temptation to do wrong. Socrates' belief in the intrinsic connection between knowledge and virtue is evident in many of his philosophical dialogues, particularly those that deal with ethical questions. For example, in Plato's dialogue Meno, Socrates explores the nature of virtue and whether it can be taught. Throughout the conversation, Socrates maintains that virtue is a form of knowledge and that it cannot be separated from wisdom. To be virtuous, one must have a clear understanding of what virtue is, and without this knowledge, true virtue is impossible. Socrates rejects the idea that virtue can be taught in the same way as other skills, such as carpentry or music. Instead, he believes that individuals must come to know virtue through self-examination and philosophical inquiry. This idea of virtue as knowledge has profound implications for how Socrates viewed moral responsibility. If wrongdoing is the result of ignorance, then those who commit immoral acts are not necessarily evil or malicious, they are simply uninformed. This perspective invites a more compassionate view of moral failings, as it suggests that the way to improve people's behavior is not through punishment or coercion, but through education and dialogue. Socrates saw himself as a kind of moral educator, helping others recognize their own ignorance and guiding them toward a deeper understanding of virtue. However, Socrates did not believe that all knowledge was of equal value. For him, the most important kind of knowledge was knowledge of the self. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, emphasizing the importance of self-awareness and self-knowledge in achieving a virtuous life. This focus on introspection and self-examination was central to Socratic ethics. Socrates believed that individuals must constantly reflect on their own beliefs, desires, and actions to ensure that they are living in accordance with virtue. One of Socrates' key insights was the idea of the unity of virtues. He believed that the different virtues, such as courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, were not separate qualities but were all interconnected and ultimately one. To possess one virtue, according to Socrates, was to possess them all, because virtue was fundamentally about having the knowledge to act rightly. For example, a person who is truly wise will also be just, courageous, and temperate, because they understand how these qualities are interconnected and essential to living a good life. This holistic view of virtue stands in contrast to other ethical theories that treat virtues as distinct qualities that one can possess in varying degrees. Socrates' emphasis on the unity of virtues is particularly evident in his discussions of courage. In the dialogue Laches, Socrates engages with two Athenian generals about the nature of courage. While the generals initially define courage as a form of physical bravery in battle, Socrates challenges this narrow definition, arguing that true courage also involves wisdom. According to Socrates, a person who is truly courageous must also understand when to act and when to refrain from action, an insight that requires knowledge and self-awareness. Courage, therefore, is not just about bravery in the face of danger, but also about making wise decisions in difficult situations. The unity of virtues also plays a significant role in Socrates' understanding of justice. In the dialogue Gorgias, Socrates debates with the sophist Callicles about the nature of justice and power. Callicles argues that justice is merely a construct of the weak, designed to restrain the strong from exercising their natural power. Socrates, however, insists that justice is an essential component of a virtuous life, and that those who seek power without regard for justice are ultimately harming themselves. For Socrates, justice is not just about following laws or acting in accordance with social norms. It is about aligning one's actions with the deeper moral truths that govern human life. One of the most radical aspects of Socratic moral philosophy is his rejection of conventional definitions of success and happiness. For many Athenians, success was measured in terms of wealth, power, and reputation. A person who was rich, influential, and admired by their peers was considered to be living a good life. Socrates, however, believed that true happiness could not be found in external goods. Instead, he argued that happiness was the result of living a virtuous life. A person who is wise and virtuous will be happy, regardless of their material circumstances. This idea, which would later be developed by philosophers like the Stoics, was revolutionary in its time and challenged the prevailing values of Athenian society. Socrates' insistence on the importance of virtue over wealth and power is particularly evident in his own life. He lived simply, rejecting the pursuit of material wealth, and spent his days engaging in philosophical discussions with his fellow citizens. Unlike the sophists, who charged fees for their teachings, Socrates did not accept payment for his philosophical work. He believed that philosophy was not a means to acquire wealth or fame, but a way of life dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. His commitment to living according to his principles made him a model of integrity for his students, even as it alienated many of his fellow Athenians. This focus on virtue as the key to happiness also influenced Socrates' views on death. In the dialogue Apology, Socrates famously declares that no harm can come to a good man, either in life or after death. He argues that if one has lived a virtuous life, there is no reason to fear death, as it is simply a transition to another state of being. This belief in the immortality of the soul and the idea that a virtuous life is rewarded after death became central themes in later philosophical and religious traditions, including Stoicism and early Christianity. Socrates' view of virtue as the key to a good life also had important implications for his understanding of governance and leadership. He believed that the best rulers were those who possessed true knowledge of virtue and justice. In the dialogue Crito, Socrates argues that individuals have a moral obligation to obey the laws of the state, even if those laws seem unjust, as long as the state itself is governed by principles of justice and virtue. This belief in the importance of virtuous leadership would later influence Plato's idea of the philosopher king, a ruler who possesses both wisdom and moral integrity. Socrates' focus on virtue and knowledge also led him to challenge traditional Athenian notions of piety and the role of the gods in human life. In the dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates engages in a debate about the nature of piety, questioning whether moral actions are good because the gods command them or whether the gods command them because they are good. This challenge to conventional religious beliefs reflects Socrates' broader commitment to questioning received wisdom and examining the foundations of moral and religious practices. In conclusion, Socrates' moral philosophy centered on the belief that knowledge is the key to virtue, and that living a virtuous life is the only path to true happiness. His insistence that moral failings are the result of ignorance, rather than malice, invites a compassionate and educational approach to ethics. Socrates' emphasis on the unity of virtues, the importance of self-knowledge, and the rejection of material wealth as a measure of success has had a profound influence on Western ethical thought. His ideas continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of morality, education, and the nature of the good life. Part 5. Socrates and the Sophists. Socrates lived and philosophized during a time when another intellectual movement was flourishing in Athens, the rise of the Sophists. These traveling teachers and thinkers offered instruction in rhetoric and persuasion, teaching the skills necessary for success in the democratic city-state of Athens. The Sophists played a significant role in shaping the intellectual landscape of ancient Greece, but their methods and ideas were fundamentally at odds with Socratic philosophy. In this part, we will explore the relationship between Socrates and the Sophists, the philosophical differences that separated them, and how Socrates' opposition to their teachings helped define his own philosophical mission. The term sophist derives from the Greek word sophia, meaning wisdom, and initially referred to anyone who was skilled in intellectual matters. However, by the time of Socrates, the word had taken on a more specialized meaning, referring to a group of itinerant teachers who offered instruction in rhetoric, politics, and ethics, often for a fee. Sophists such as Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias were famous for their ability to teach young Athenian men the skills of persuasion and public speaking, which were essential for success in the democratic political system of Athens. The Sophists were particularly influential in Athens because they catered to the needs of the city's political elite. In a democratic society where public debate and persuasion were critical to gaining power and influence, the ability to speak convincingly and argue persuasively was highly valued. The Sophists promised to teach these skills, offering their students the tools to succeed in politics, law, and public life. However, this emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion over truth and knowledge put them at odds with Socrates, who believed that the pursuit of wisdom should be the primary goal of philosophy. One of the key philosophical differences between Socrates and the Sophists was their attitude toward truth and morality. The Sophists were often associated with a form of moral relativism, the idea that truth and morality are not absolute, but vary according to individual perspectives or cultural norms. Protagoras, one of the most famous Sophists, is best known for his statement, "Man is the measure of all things," which suggests that truth is subjective and dependent on the individual. For the Sophists, what was true or right was often a matter of social convention or rhetorical skill, rather than an objective reality. Socrates, on the other hand, believed that there was an objective truth that could be discovered through reason and dialogue. He rejected the idea that truth and morality were relative, arguing that ethical principles were universal and could be known through rational inquiry. Socrates saw the Sophists' emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion as dangerous because it prioritized winning arguments over discovering the truth. In his view, the Sophists were more concerned with teaching their students how to appear wise and successful than with helping them achieve genuine understanding. The difference between Socrates and the Sophists can also be seen in their approach to teaching. The Sophists were professional educators who charged fees for their services, and their teaching was often focused on practical skills that could be used in public life, such as rhetoric and political strategy. Socrates, in contrast, did not consider himself a teacher in the traditional sense. He did not charge fees for his conversations, nor did he offer formal instruction. Instead, Socrates engaged in public dialogues with people from all walks of life, questioning them about their beliefs and encouraging them to examine their assumptions. He believed that true knowledge could not be taught in a conventional way, but had to be discovered through self-examination and critical dialogue. Socrates' rejection of the sophists' methods and ideas is evident in several of Plato's dialogues, particularly Gorgias and Protagoras. In these dialogues, Socrates debates with prominent sophists, exposing what he saw as the weaknesses in their arguments and their lack of concern for truth and virtue. In Gorgias, for example, Socrates engages in a conversation with the famous rhetorician Gorgias about the nature of rhetoric and its relationship to justice. Gorgias argues that rhetoric is a powerful tool that can be used to persuade people and achieve success in public life, regardless of the moral implications of one's actions. Socrates, however, insists that rhetoric, if used without regard for justice and truth, is a form of manipulation that leads people away from virtue. In Protagoras, Socrates debates with the sophist Protagoras about whether virtue can be taught. While Protagoras believes that virtue can be taught like any other skill, Socrates questions this assumption, arguing that virtue is not a matter of practical instruction but of deep philosophical understanding. For Socrates, virtue was not something that could be handed down from one person to another, but something that individuals had to discover for themselves through rigorous self-examination and the pursuit of wisdom. Socrates' opposition to the sophists was not just a matter of intellectual disagreement. It also reflected his broader concern with the moral and political health of Athens. He believed that the sophists, by teaching young men how to use rhetoric to gain power and influence without regard for truth or justice, were contributing to the moral decay of the city. In his view, the sophists encouraged a form of intellectual dishonesty, in which winning arguments and gaining power took precedence over living a virtuous life. Socrates saw himself as a corrective to this trend, offering an alternative approach to philosophy that prioritized the search for truth and the cultivation of virtue. Despite his opposition to the sophists, Socrates shared some common ground with them, particularly in his recognition of the importance of language and dialogue in shaping human understanding. Like the sophists, Socrates believed that philosophical inquiry could take place through conversation and debate. However, whereas the sophists used language as a tool for persuasion, Socrates used it as a tool for uncovering truth. His method of questioning and dialogue, known as the Socratic method, was designed to expose contradictions in his interlocutors' beliefs and lead them to a deeper understanding of the issues at hand. One of the reasons Socrates was so critical of the sophists is that he believed their methods of persuasion were deceptive. In his view, the sophists were more interested in making the weaker argument appear stronger, as he accused them of doing in dialogues like the Apology. Socrates argued that this form of rhetoric was dangerous because it allowed individuals to justify immoral actions and manipulate others for their own benefit. By focusing on the art of persuasion rather than the pursuit of truth, the sophists contributed to a culture in which success and power were valued over justice and virtue. Socrates' criticism of the sophists was also tied to his broader critique of Athenian society. He believed that the pursuit of wealth, power, and fame had corrupted the moral fabric of the city, and that the sophists, by teaching young men how to achieve these goals through rhetoric and persuasion, were reinforcing this corruption. Socrates saw himself as a kind of moral gadfly, challenging the complacency of his fellow citizens and encouraging them to seek higher moral principles. However, despite Socrates' critique of the sophists, it is important to recognize that the sophists were not a monolithic group. Different sophists had different views on truth, ethics, and rhetoric, and some were more concerned with philosophical inquiry than others. For example, Protagoras, despite his relativism, engaged seriously with questions of ethics and politics, while Gorgias was more focused on the power of language and persuasion. Socrates' debates with the sophists, particularly Protagoras, reveal the intellectual complexity of the issues at stake and the richness of the philosophical discussions taking place in Athens at the time. In conclusion, Socrates' opposition to the sophists was a defining feature of his philosophy and helped shape his approach to ethics, politics, and education. While the sophists emphasized rhetoric and persuasion, Socrates insisted on the importance of truth and virtue. His critique of the sophists reflected his broader concern with the moral and political health of Athens and his belief that philosophy should be a tool for self-examination and the pursuit of wisdom, rather than a means to gain power and success. The debates between Socrates and the sophists remain some of the most important and influential in the history of Western philosophy, and they continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about truth, morality, and the role of education. Part 6. The Oracle of Delphi and Socratic Wisdom. One of the most intriguing episodes in Socrates' life, and a key moment in understanding his philosophy, is his relationship with the Oracle of Delphi. This story, recounted by Socrates during his trial in Plato's Apology, plays a crucial role in explaining why Socrates adopted the philosophical mission that ultimately defined his life. According to Socrates, the oracle declared that no one was wiser than he, a statement that set him on a lifelong quest to understand the meaning of this pronouncement and the nature of wisdom itself. The Oracle of Delphi was a highly respected religious institution in ancient Greece, where individuals and city-states would consult the god Apollo for advice and prophecies. The oracle was a priestess known as the Pythia, who would deliver cryptic responses to the questions posed to her. These responses were often interpreted by priests, and the answers were considered to have divine authority. It was widely believed that the oracle could provide guidance on matters of politics, war, and even personal decisions. Consulting the oracle was a way to gain insight into the will of the gods, and its pronouncements held significant weight in Greek society. Socrates' friend Chaerephon, a loyal follower and admirer of the philosopher, is said to have asked the oracle at Delphi whether there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle responded that there was no one wiser. When Chaerephon relayed this message to Socrates, the philosopher was puzzled. Socrates did not consider himself wise, and the oracle's statement seemed at odds with his own self-perception. This paradox led Socrates on a journey of inquiry, as he sought to understand the meaning of the oracle's words. Socrates' reaction to the oracle's pronouncement is a testament to his unique approach to philosophy. Rather than accepting the oracle's words at face value and assuming that he was indeed the wisest of all, Socrates chose to investigate the claim. He reasoned that if the oracle, a divine institution, had declared him the wisest, then it must be true. However, since he did not believe himself to possess any special wisdom, he set out to determine whether anyone else could be wiser than he was. This investigation became a central theme of Socrates' life. He began to question various prominent figures in Athenian society, politicians, poets, and craftsmen, whom he believed to be wise. Through his method of questioning, Socrates quickly realized that although these individuals were highly regarded for their knowledge and expertise, they often did not possess true wisdom. Politicians claimed to know how to govern, but upon further inquiry, Socrates found that they were unable to articulate the principles of justice and virtue that should guide their decisions. Poets, while able to compose beautiful verses, could not explain the meaning behind their works or the nature of artistic inspiration. Craftsmen, though skilled in their trades, often believed that their technical knowledge extended to areas outside their expertise, leading them to make false claims about topics they did not truly understand. Through these encounters, Socrates came to the conclusion that his wisdom lay in the fact that he recognized his own ignorance. Unlike the politicians, poets, and craftsmen, Socrates did not pretend to know things that he did not know. His wisdom was, paradoxically, the recognition that he was not wise in the conventional sense. This acknowledgement of his own ignorance became a central tenet of Socratic philosophy and a key element of his method of inquiry. Socrates' humility in the face of the oracle's pronouncement is one of the defining features of his intellectual legacy. He believed that true wisdom began with the recognition of one's limitations. This idea, that wisdom is rooted in an awareness of ignorance, marked a radical departure from the intellectual traditions of his time. In ancient Greece, knowledge and expertise were highly valued, and those who possessed specialized knowledge were often regarded as wise. However, Socrates challenged this notion by emphasizing that wisdom was not simply about having technical or specialized knowledge, but about understanding the limits of one's own knowledge. In this sense, Socrates' approach to wisdom was more philosophical and self-reflective than the traditional views of wisdom in Athenian society. Socrates' interpretation of the oracle's message also had profound ethical implications. If true wisdom consisted in recognizing one's ignorance, then the pursuit of wisdom was an ongoing process, one that required constant questioning and self-examination. This approach to wisdom is closely related to Socrates' moral philosophy, which emphasized the importance of living an examined life. For Socrates, the unexamined life was not worth living because it involved accepting false beliefs and assumptions without critical reflection. The process of questioning and seeking deeper understanding was essential to achieving moral and intellectual integrity. In his dialogues with his fellow Athenians, Socrates often referred to himself as a gadfly, a metaphor whose writings provide the primary source of information about Socrates' life and teachings. Plato was profoundly influenced by Socratic thought, and his dialogues, many of which feature Socrates as a central character, preserve the essence of the Socratic method and philosophy. Through Plato's works, Socrates' ideas have been immortalized, reaching far beyond the confines of ancient Athens and shaping the entire trajectory of Western philosophy. Plato was not Socrates' only notable student, however. Socrates had a diverse group of followers, including young aristocrats like Alcibiades and Critias, as well as others who would go on to play key roles in Athenian politics and intellectual life. Socrates' influence on these individuals varied significantly. Some were inspired by his teachings and adopted his philosophical principles, while others used their connection to him for political purposes, even though their actions were often at odds with Socratic values. Alcibiades is one of the most controversial figures associated with Socrates. A brilliant and ambitious Athenian statesman and general, Alcibiades was known for his charisma, military prowess, and opportunistic behavior. He played a pivotal role in the Peloponnesian War, switching sides multiple times between Athens, Sparta, and Persia, as he sought to advance his personal power. Despite his obvious talents, Alcibiades was also notorious for his reckless behavior, and his political career was marked by scandal and betrayal. His relationship with Socrates is complex, as Socrates appears to have been both fascinated by and critical of Alcibiades' character. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades speaks at length about his admiration for Socrates, describing him as an extraordinary figure who possessed both intellectual brilliance and moral integrity. According to Alcibiades, Socrates was unlike anyone else he had ever met, someone who seemed immune to physical desires and who consistently prioritized the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. Alcibiades confesses that he was drawn to Socrates not only because of his philosophical insight, but also because of the moral strength that Socrates displayed in both public and private life. However, despite this admiration, Alcibiades was ultimately unable to live up to Socratic ideals, as his personal ambition and desire for power often led him down morally questionable paths. Socrates' relationship with Alcibiades highlights one of the challenges he faced as a philosopher and teacher. While Socrates sought to instill a love of wisdom and virtue in his students, he could not control how they applied his teachings in their own lives. Alcibiades' political career, with its many betrayals and shifting allegiances, stands in stark contrast to Socratic principles of integrity and justice. Yet, despite Alcibiades' failings, his deep respect for Socrates suggests that the philosopher's influence was significant, even if it did not always lead to virtuous action. Another controversial figure associated with Socrates was Critias, who would later become one of the leaders of the 30 Tyrants, a brutal oligarchic regime that briefly ruled Athens following its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Critias, like Alcibiades, was an aristocrat who studied under Socrates and was influenced by his ideas. However, Critias' actions as one of the 30 Tyrants were starkly opposed to the values of justice and fairness that Socrates championed. The 30 Tyrants were responsible for numerous political purges, executions, and confiscations of property, and their rule was characterized by terror and oppression. Critias' association with Socrates became a key issue during Socrates' trial in 399 BCE, as his enemies accused him of corrupting the youth and influencing figures like Critias and Alcibiades to commit crimes against the state. While there is no evidence to suggest that Socrates condoned the actions of Critias or Alcibiades, their connection to him certainly played a role in the accusations brought against him. Socrates' critics argued that by encouraging his students to question traditional values and beliefs, he had sown the seeds of political and social unrest, leading to the downfall of the democratic government. Despite these controversies, Socrates also had students who were deeply committed to his philosophy and who went on to lead lives of intellectual and moral integrity. One of these students was Xenophon, a historian, soldier, and philosopher who wrote several works that provide important insights into Socrates' life and teachings. Unlike Plato's dialogues, which often focus on abstract philosophical questions, Xenophon's works, such as Memorabilia and Symposium, present a more practical and down-to-earth picture of Socrates. Xenophon admired Socrates for his ability to live a virtuous life in both public and private matters, and his writings emphasize Socrates' role as a moral teacher who encouraged his students to live ethically. Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates is somewhat different from Plato's, as it focuses more on the practical aspects of his teachings than on abstract philosophical concepts. For example, Xenophon highlights Socrates' concern with everyday virtues like temperance, self-control, and moderation, and he presents Socrates as someone who was deeply interested in helping his students develop practical moral habits. While Plato's Socrates is often seen as a seeker of transcendent truths, Xenophon's Socrates is more of a moral guide, offering practical advice on how to live a good and virtuous life. Through Plato and Xenophon, we get two different but complementary pictures of Socrates. Plato emphasizes Socrates as a seeker of wisdom and a challenger of conventional beliefs, while Xenophon presents him as a moral teacher who was deeply concerned with the well-being of his students and fellow citizens. Together, these accounts provide a rich and multifaceted portrait of Socrates, showing both his intellectual rigor and his commitment to ethical living. It is also important to note that Socrates' students were not limited to young aristocrats or political figures. Socrates engaged in dialogues with people from all walks of life, including artisans, craftsmen, and everyday citizens. He believed that philosophy was not just for the elite, but for anyone who was willing to question their assumptions and seek truth. His willingness to engage with ordinary people is one of the reasons he became such a well-known figure in Athens, and it contributed to both his popularity and his eventual downfall. Socrates' relationship with his students was unique in that he did not consider himself a traditional teacher. He famously claimed that he had no knowledge to impart, and instead saw himself as a midwife of ideas, helping others give birth to their own understanding through questioning and dialogue. This approach was radically different from the sophists, who offered formal instruction and claimed to teach wisdom for a fee. Socrates, by contrast, did not charge for his conversations, and he saw his role as a guide rather than as an authority figure. His method of teaching was based on mutual inquiry, where both he and his interlocutors could learn from the process of questioning. This method of dialogue, known as the Socratic method, was central to Socrates' relationship with his students. Rather than providing answers, Socrates would ask probing questions that forced his students to think critically about their own beliefs and assumptions. Through this process, they would often come to realize that their understanding of concepts like justice, virtue, or courage was incomplete or flawed. Socrates believed that this recognition of ignorance was the first step toward true wisdom. His goal was not to impart knowledge, but to encourage a lifelong pursuit of truth and understanding. In conclusion, Socrates' relationship with his students was a defining aspect of his life and legacy. Through his dialogues and personal interactions, he inspired a generation of thinkers who would go on to shape the intellectual and political life of ancient Greece. While some of his students, like Alcibiades and Critias, used their connection to him for personal and political gain, others, like Plato and Xenophon, were deeply influenced by his philosophical teachings and helped to preserve and transmit his ideas to future generations. Socrates' unique approach to teaching, based on dialogue and mutual inquiry, has left an enduring mark on Western thought, and his influence can still be felt in modern education and philosophy. His commitment to the pursuit of wisdom, virtue, and self-examination continues to inspire thinkers and students around the world. Part 8. The Trial of Socrates. The trial of Socrates in 399 BCE is one of the most famous events in the history of Western philosophy. It serves as a crucial moment in the life of the philosopher and marks the culmination of his conflicts with the Athenian establishment. His trial not only reflects the political and social tensions of the time, but also encapsulates his philosophical ideals of truth, virtue, and the examined life. In this part, we will explore the circumstances leading up to Socrates' trial, the charges brought against him, the trial itself, and the significance of his defense. Socrates had long been a controversial figure in Athens, known for his relentless questioning of commonly accepted beliefs and his tendency to expose the ignorance of the city's leaders, poets, and intellectuals. Over time, his method of publicly interrogating people about their knowledge, or lack thereof, had earned him both admirers and enemies. While his students and followers saw him as a figure of wisdom, many others viewed him as a subversive influence who undermined traditional values and norms. The political context of Socrates' trial is essential to understanding why he was brought to court. In the years leading up to his trial, Athens had experienced a period of turmoil, particularly after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Following the war, the city was briefly ruled by an oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants, who were notorious for their brutality and repression. Although Socrates had no direct involvement in the actions of the 30 Tyrants, some of his former students, including Critias, were prominent members of the regime. This association would later be used against him by his accusers. When democracy was restored in Athens, there was a desire to purge the city of those who were seen as corrupting influences, particularly those associated with the oligarchs. In this atmosphere of political instability and recrimination, Socrates' behavior and associations made him a target for prosecution. His unconventional ideas, his refusal to conform to traditional norms, and his perceived influence over the youth of Athens all contributed to the perception that he was a dangerous figure. The formal charges against Socrates were brought by 3 accusers: Meletus, a poet; Anytus, a powerful politician; and Lyco, an orator. The charges were twofold: impiety, for not believing in the gods of the city and introducing new deities, and corrupting the youth of Athens. These charges were serious in a deeply religious city like Athens, where respect for the gods was considered essential to maintaining social and political order. Additionally, the charge of corrupting the youth implied that Socrates was leading the next generation of Athenians astray, teaching them to challenge traditional values and authority. Socrates' trial took place in front of a jury of 501 Athenian citizens, as was customary in cases of this magnitude. The jury was composed of ordinary citizens, not legal experts, and their decision was based as much on rhetoric and persuasion as on evidence. In the Apology, Plato provides a detailed account of Socrates' defense speech, giving us valuable insights into how Socrates approached the charges against him and how he defended his philosophical mission. Rather than pleading for mercy or attempting to win the sympathy of the jury, Socrates used his defense as an opportunity to reaffirm his commitment to truth and philosophy. He began by addressing the long-standing rumors and prejudices against him, acknowledging that many people had been influenced by years of slander. Socrates explained that his reputation as a corrupter of the youth and a subversive influence had been built over time, largely due to his practice of questioning those who claimed to be wise. This, he argued, had earned him many enemies, particularly among the powerful and influential in Athens. Socrates then turned to the specific charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. In response to the accusation that he did not believe in the gods of the city, Socrates argued that his philosophical inquiries were, in fact, in line with divine will. He recounted the story of the Oracle of Delphi, which had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates explained that his philosophical mission was motivated by a desire to understand the meaning of the oracle's words and to encourage others to pursue wisdom as well. In this sense, Socrates saw himself as carrying out a divine mission, and he rejected the claim that he was introducing new gods. As for the charge of corrupting the youth, Socrates questioned whether he could be held responsible for the actions of his students. He argued that he had never intentionally harmed anyone, and that if he had unintentionally led anyone astray, it was a matter of ignorance rather than malice. Furthermore, Socrates pointed out that many of his students had gone on to lead honorable lives, and he questioned whether the actions of a few should be used to condemn his entire philosophical practice. Throughout his defense, Socrates remained defiant, refusing to compromise his principles for the sake of avoiding punishment. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living, a statement that encapsulates his belief that philosophy and the pursuit of truth were more important than personal safety or societal approval. Socrates argued that he had been a benefactor to the city, acting as a gadfly, who provoked the citizens of Athens to question their beliefs and seek greater understanding. He warned the jury that by condemning him, they would only harm themselves, as his death would not rid the city of its problems or lead to greater wisdom. Socrates' refusal to pander to the jury or offer a conventional defense is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the trial. Unlike many defendants, who would have sought to elicit sympathy or offer a plea for clemency, Socrates remained steadfast in his commitment to his philosophical ideals. He made it clear that he would rather face death than abandon his mission or betray his principles. In this sense, his trial became not just a legal proceeding but a public demonstration of his philosophical integrity. Despite Socrates' eloquent defense, the jury found him guilty by a narrow margin. Under Athenian law, both the prosecution and the defendant were allowed to propose a penalty, and the jury would then decide between the two. The prosecution called for the death penalty, while Socrates, in a move that shocked many, suggested that he should be rewarded with free meals for life in recognition of his service to the city. This suggestion was more than just a rhetorical flourish. It reflected Socrates' belief that his philosophical mission had been beneficial to Athens and that he had acted in the best interests of the city. When it became clear that the jury would not accept this proposal, Socrates offered an alternative penalty, a fine. However, by this point, it was too late to sway the jury's opinion. The majority of the jury voted for the death penalty, and Socrates was sentenced to die by drinking hemlock, a common method of execution in ancient Athens. Socrates' reaction to his death sentence was one of calm acceptance. In the Apology and Plato's later dialogue Phaedo, Socrates is depicted as facing his death with composure and philosophical reflection. He argued that death was not something to be feared, as it was either a transition to a better existence or a state of nothingness, neither of which should cause distress. Socrates maintained that a just man had nothing to fear from death, as true harm came not from external events but from acting unjustly. Socrates' trial and execution had a profound impact on his followers and on the history of philosophy. For his students, particularly Plato, the trial was a stark reminder of the dangers of living a life dedicated to questioning authority and challenging conventional beliefs. Plato would go on to use Socrates' trial as a central theme in many of his dialogues, exploring the tension between the philosopher and the state, and the conflict between truth and popular opinion. In the centuries that followed, Socrates' trial became a symbol of the philosopher's commitment to truth and virtue in the face of societal pressure. His willingness to die for his beliefs elevated him to the status of a martyr for philosophy, and his legacy as a thinker who refused to compromise his principles has inspired generations of philosophers, educators, and activists. In conclusion, The trial of Socrates was not just a legal case, but a clash between two different visions of life and society. Socrates represented the life of inquiry, truth, and moral integrity, while his accusers represented the conventional values of the city, concerned with maintaining order and tradition. Socrates' defense, while unsuccessful in legal terms, remains a powerful testament to the importance of living a life of philosophical reflection, even in the face of death. His trial and execution continue to resonate as a powerful reminder of the costs and rewards of living an examined life. Part 9. Socrates' Defense, Apology. Socrates' defense during his trial, as recorded by Plato in the dialogue Apology, is one of the most compelling speeches in Western philosophy. It is not only a defense against the specific legal charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, but also a broader defense of his entire philosophical way of life. The Apology captures the essence of Socratic thought, his unwavering commitment to truth, and his belief in the examined life. This part will delve into the key themes of Socrates' defense, how he framed his arguments, and why his approach was so revolutionary. From the beginning of his defense, Socrates adopts a tone of frankness and sincerity, refusing to resort to rhetorical tricks or emotional appeals that might sway the jury in his favor. He acknowledges that many of the jurors have long been prejudiced against him due to rumors and accusations that had circulated for years. Socrates claims that these earlier accusations, more than the specific charges brought by Miletus, Anytus, and Lyco, are what have damaged his reputation. His philosophical inquiries, his habit of questioning people about their beliefs and knowledge, had earned him many enemies in Athens, especially among the powerful. One of the central points of Socrates' defense is that he has never claimed to possess knowledge or wisdom. Rather, he presents himself as someone who, unlike his accusers, is fully aware of his own ignorance. This theme of humility, expressed through his famous statement, "I know that I know nothing," becomes a key element of his defense. Socrates argues that his wisdom, if it can be called that, lies in his recognition that he does not possess the kind of knowledge that others claim to have. He contrasts his own intellectual humility with the arrogance of those who pretend to know things they do not. Socrates explains that his philosophical mission began with the oracle of Delphi, which declared that no one was wiser than he. Puzzled by this pronouncement, Socrates set out to test the wisdom of others, particularly those who were reputed to be wise. Through his dialogues with politicians, poets, and craftsmen, Socrates discovered that while these individuals often possessed technical skills or knowledge in certain areas, they lacked a deeper understanding of fundamental concepts like justice, virtue, and the good life. This realization led Socrates to conclude that the oracle statement was true in a paradoxical sense. He was wiser than others only because he recognized the limits of his knowledge. Throughout the Apology, Socrates positions himself as a moral and intellectual gadfly, a term he uses to describe his role in Athenian society. Just as a gadfly stings a horse to keep it awake and alert, Socrates believed that his philosophical questioning was necessary to prevent the citizens of Athens from becoming complacent. He saw himself as a servant of the gods, fulfilling a divine mission by challenging people to examine their lives and reflect on their beliefs. His questioning, far from being subversive or corrupting, was a form of public service aimed at improving the moral character of the city. This idea of Socrates as a gadfly is central to his defense against the charge of corrupting the youth. Socrates argues that he never intentionally harmed anyone, and that if he had unintentionally influenced someone in a negative way, it was done out of ignorance, not malice. He points out that many of his students and followers have gone on to lead respectable lives, and that there is no evidence to suggest that his teachings have led to widespread corruption. Furthermore, Socrates challenges his accusers to present concrete examples of the harm he has supposedly caused, but they are unable to do so. Socrates also confronts the charge of impiety, or not believing in the gods of Athens. He questions the logic of this accusation, pointing out that the very act of engaging in philosophical inquiry and searching for truth is, in his view, a form of piety. Socrates explains that his philosophical practice is in line with the will of the gods, as evidenced by the oracle of Delphi's pronouncement. He rejects the claim that he has introduced new deities, arguing that his belief in a divine voice or daimonion that guides him is not an attempt to replace the traditional gods, but rather a personal spiritual experience that complements his belief in divine providence. One of the most striking aspects of Socrates' defense is his refusal to compromise his principles in order to avoid, as he believes that no harm can come to a good person, either in life or after death. Socrates argues that death is either a transition to a better existence or a state of peaceful nothingness, and in either case, there is nothing to fear. Socrates' calm acceptance of his death sentence is a powerful demonstration of his philosophical outlook. Throughout his life, he had emphasized the importance of living in accordance with virtue and reason, And now, in the face of death, he remains true to his principles. For Socrates, the pursuit of truth and moral integrity was worth more than life itself, and his willingness to die for his beliefs elevated him to the status of a martyr for philosophy. In his final words, Socrates offers a parting message to those who voted for his conviction. He warns them that by condemning him, they have harmed themselves more than they have harmed him. Socrates suggests that his death will not rid Athens of its problems, as there will be others who continue his work of questioning and challenging the status quo. He leaves the jury with a sense of foreboding, implying that future generations will look back on his trial as a miscarriage of justice. The apology is more than just a legal defense. It is a philosophical statement about the nature of justice, the value of critical inquiry, and the importance of living a life dedicated to truth. Socrates' defense is a profound articulation of the ideals that he had lived by and for which he was willing to die. His trial, though legally unjust, became a defining moment in the history of Western thought, as it exemplified the tension between the philosopher and society, between the pursuit of truth and the demands of conventional morality. In the centuries that followed, Socrates' defense has been interpreted as a model of philosophical courage and integrity. His willingness to stand by his convictions, even in the face of death, has inspired generations of thinkers, activists, and intellectuals who seek to challenge authority and question established norms. The Apology remains one of the most important texts in the Western philosophical tradition, not only for its defense of Socratic philosophy, but also for its timeless exploration of the human condition. In conclusion, Socrates' defense in the Apology was not just a response to the legal charges against him, but a broader defense of his way of life and his philosophical mission. His insistence on the importance of the examined life, his rejection of rhetorical manipulation, and his acceptance of death in the service of truth have made his defense one of the most influential speeches in the history of philosophy. Socrates' legacy as a philosopher who refused to compromise his principles, even in the face of death, continues to resonate today as a powerful testament to the value of critical inquiry and the pursuit of wisdom. Part 10. Death and Legacy. The death of Socrates marked a turning point, not only in Athenian history, but also in the development of Western philosophy. His execution by drinking hemlock is one of the most famous events in the annals of philosophy, symbolizing the conflict between the individual philosopher and the broader society. Socrates' death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a powerful statement about the cost of intellectual integrity, the dangers of questioning authority, and the enduring value of the examined life. After his trial, Socrates was sentenced to death by consuming a potion made from the poison hemlock. According to Plato's dialogue Phaedo, which recounts the final moments of Socrates' life, the philosopher accepted his fate with remarkable calm and composure. In his last hours, Socrates continued to engage in philosophical discussions with his friends and disciples, showing that even in the face of death, his commitment to philosophical inquiry never wavered. In Phaedo, Plato portrays Socrates as maintaining his belief in the immortality of the soul. He suggests that death is not something to be feared because it is either a peaceful end or a transition to a better state of existence where the soul is freed from the limitations of the body. Socrates argued that if one has lived a virtuous life, there is no reason to fear death, as the soul will be rewarded in the afterlife. This serene acceptance of death reflects Socrates' profound belief in the importance of living a just and virtuous life, one that is in harmony with the higher principles of truth and morality. The scene of Socrates' death is poignant, as it represents the ultimate test of his philosophical principles. Throughout his life, Socrates had emphasized the importance of moral integrity and the pursuit of truth, even at great personal cost. Now, in his final moments, he demonstrated the courage to live and die by those same principles. His refusal to flee Athens or compromise his beliefs, even when faced with execution, set him apart from many other figures of his time. For Socrates, philosophy was not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that demanded total commitment. In the hours leading up to his execution, Socrates' friends tried to persuade him to escape from prison, offering to bribe the guards and arrange for his safe passage out of Athens. However, Socrates rejected this offer, arguing that it would be unjust for him to flee. He believed that since he had chosen to live under Athenian law, he had a duty to accept the consequences of that choice, even if the laws were unjustly applied in his case. To flee would be to undermine the very principles of justice and the rule of law that he had spent his life defending. This commitment to justice, even in the face of personal loss, is one of the most striking aspects of Socrates' philosophy. Socrates' decision to accept his death sentence can also be seen as an expression of his belief that moral integrity is more important than physical survival. Throughout his trial, Socrates had argued that living a virtuous life was the highest good, and he demonstrated that belief in his willingness to die for his principles. His death became a powerful symbol of the philosopher's role in society as someone who challenges conventional thinking and is willing to face persecution for the sake of truth. The legacy of Socrates' death extends far beyond his immediate circle of followers. His execution shocked many in Athens, including those who had supported his trial. Some Athenians came to regret the decision to execute him, particularly as the years passed and his students, most notably Plato, continued to develop and spread his ideas. Socrates' death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of silencing intellectual dissent and the tension between democracy and philosophy. In the immediate aftermath of Socrates' death, his followers were deeply affected by the loss of their teacher. Plato, who was in his 20s at the time of Socrates' execution, was particularly shaken by the event. Plato would later write a series of dialogues in which Socrates is the main character, using these texts to preserve and explore his teacher's ideas. These dialogues, including Apology, Crito, Phaedo, and Republic, became foundational works in Western philosophy, ensuring that Socrates' ideas would be passed down to future generations. Plato's works transformed Socrates from a local Athenian figure into a universal symbol of philosophical inquiry and integrity. Through Plato, Socrates' method of questioning, his focus on virtue, and his belief in the importance of the examined life became central to the development of Western thought. Plato also expanded on many of Socrates' ideas, particularly in areas like metaphysics and political theory, though it is often difficult to distinguish where Socratic thought ends and Platonic philosophy begins. Socrates' influence was not limited to Plato. Another of his students, Xenophon, also wrote extensively about Socrates. Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates, while less philosophical than Plato's, offers a more practical and down-to-earth depiction of his teacher. In works such as Memorabilia and Symposium, Xenophon presents Socrates as a moral guide who provided ethical instruction to his followers through everyday conversations. While Xenophon's Socrates is less concerned with abstract philosophical questions than Plato's, he still emphasizes the importance of virtue and self-discipline. Socrates' death also had a lasting impact on Athenian society and the development of its legal and political institutions. His trial and execution raised important questions about the relationship between the individual and the state, the role of democracy, and the limits of free expression. For many, Socrates' death became a symbol of the dangers of mob rule and the potential for democratic systems to suppress dissenting voices. These concerns would later influence political thinkers and philosophers throughout history, particularly during periods of political turmoil and authoritarianism. The image of Socrates as a martyr for philosophy, someone who willingly gave his life in the pursuit of truth, became deeply embedded in Western intellectual culture. Over the centuries, Socrates has been seen as a model of intellectual courage, moral integrity, and the uncompromising pursuit of wisdom. His life and death have inspired countless thinkers, from ancient philosophers like Aristotle to modern figures such as Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre. One of the most enduring aspects of Socrates' legacy is his method of philosophical inquiry, known as the Socratic method. This approach, based on dialogue and questioning, continues to be used in education, particularly in the fields of law, philosophy, and ethics. The Socratic method encourages critical thinking, self-examination, and the pursuit of truth through conversation. It remains one of the most effective tools for fostering intellectual curiosity and moral reflection. Socrates' influence can also be seen in the development of later philosophical schools, such as Stoicism and Cynicism, both of which were deeply influenced by his emphasis on virtue and self-discipline. The Stoics, particularly figures like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, were drawn to Socrates' idea that true happiness comes from living in accordance with virtue, regardless of external circumstances. The Cynics, like Diogenes, admired Socrates' rejection of material wealth and his focus on living a simple, self-sufficient life. In conclusion, Socrates' death and legacy have had a profound and lasting impact on the history of philosophy and Western thought. His willingness to die for his beliefs, his commitment to moral integrity, and his method of philosophical inquiry have made him a symbol of intellectual courage and the pursuit of truth. Through the works of his students, particularly Plato and Xenophon, Socrates' ideas have been preserved and expanded, influencing generations of philosophers, educators, and thinkers. His life and death continue to inspire those who seek to challenge conventional wisdom and live a life dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. Part 11. Socrates' influence on Plato and Aristotle. The profound influence that Socrates had on his students is most notably reflected in the works of Plato and, later, Aristotle. Although Socrates left no writings of his own, it is through Plato's dialogues that his ideas and methods have been immortalized. Plato's philosophical development, as well as the subsequent ideas of Aristotle, can be seen as deeply rooted in the Socratic tradition, with both philosophers expanding on Socratic thought in transformative ways. In this part, we will examine how Socrates influenced Plato and Aristotle, how his legacy shaped their works, and how the three philosophers together laid the foundation for Western philosophy. Socrates' influence on Plato. The development of Platonic thought. Plato was one of Socrates' most devoted students, and his portrayal of Socrates in his dialogues has had a lasting impact on the way Socrates is perceived in the history of philosophy. After Socrates' execution, Plato became determined to preserve and expand upon his teacher's ideas. In his early dialogues, such as Apology, Crito, and Euthyphro, Plato presents Socrates as the central figure, often engaging in dialectical debates about ethical and philosophical issues. These dialogues capture Socrates' method of questioning, his search for definitions of key ethical concepts like justice, virtue, and piety, and his emphasis on the examined life. However, as Plato's own philosophical ideas developed, particularly in his middle and later dialogues, his portrayal of Socrates began to evolve. Plato's middle dialogues, including Phaedo, Symposium, and the Republic, present Socratic themes alongside Plato's own metaphysical ideas, most notably the theory of forms. While these dialogues continue to feature Socrates as the protagonist, the ideas expressed are increasingly reflective of Plato's own philosophical system. In the Republic, for example, Socrates engages in a dialogue about the nature of justice and the ideal city-state, but the metaphysical and political vision articulated is largely Plato's own. The theory of forms, one of Plato's most significant contributions to philosophy, is a development that owes its origins to Socratic questioning but extends beyond Socratic thought. Plato's theory posits that the physical world is not the ultimate reality, but rather a reflection of a higher, unchanging reality, the world of forms or ideas. According to Plato, the forms are perfect, abstract entities that exist independently of the material world, and everything in the material world is an imperfect representation of these ideal forms. For instance, individual beautiful objects in the world participate in the form of beauty, which is eternal and unchanging. While Socrates was primarily concerned with ethical questions and the pursuit of moral knowledge, Plato expanded these concerns into a metaphysical framework. The theory of forms provided Plato with a way to explain the nature of reality and the relationship between knowledge and perception. Although Socrates himself did not articulate such a theory, his focus on defining ethical concepts and seeking eternal truths laid the groundwork for Plato's metaphysical speculations. In this sense, Plato's philosophy can be seen as an extension and systematization of Socratic thought. Another important way in which Socrates influenced Plato was through his conception of the philosopher's role in society. In the Republic, Plato develops the idea of the philosopher king, a ruler who possesses both wisdom and virtue and is therefore uniquely qualified to govern the ideal city-state. This idea is rooted in Socratic principles, particularly the belief that only those who possess true knowledge of the good should be entrusted with power. Socrates' criticism of Athenian democracy, which placed decision-making in the hands of ordinary citizens who lacked philosophical wisdom, is reflected in Plato's vision of a hierarchical society where philosophers rule based on their knowledge of the forms. At the same time, Plato's political ideas go beyond those of Socrates. While Socrates was critical of the democratic system, he did not advocate for a specific political structure. Plato, however, develops a detailed political theory in the Republic, outlining the structure of an ideal state governed by philosopher kings. In this ideal state, the rulers possess knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, and their governance is guided by this knowledge. Plato's idealism in this regard is a natural outgrowth of Socratic thought, but it represents a significant philosophical leap beyond the concerns of Socratic ethics. Aristotle's relationship to Socratic and Platonic thought. Aristotle, a student of Plato, was also profoundly influenced by Socratic philosophy, although his approach diverged significantly from both his teacher and Socrates. While Plato and Aristotle shared a common intellectual lineage through their engagement with Socratic ideas, Aristotle's method and conclusions marked a shift towards empiricism and a more practical approach to philosophy. Like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle was deeply concerned with questions of ethics, virtue, and the nature of the good life. However, while Plato emphasized the importance of abstract, transcendent forms, Aristotle rejected the theory of forms and focused instead on studying the natural world and human experience. Aristotle believed that knowledge could be gained through observation and reasoning about the physical world, and he saw no need to posit a separate realm of abstract entities. In contrast to Plato's metaphysical idealism, Aristotle developed a more empirical and grounded approach to philosophy, emphasizing the importance of studying the natural world in order to understand reality. Aristotle's ethical theory, known as virtue ethics, was heavily influenced by Socratic ideas, but was developed in a more practical direction. Like Socrates, Aristotle believed that virtue was central to living a good life, and he agreed that virtue could be cultivated through knowledge and practice. However, while Socrates often focused on the intellectual aspect of virtue, arguing that knowledge is necessary for virtuous action, Aristotle placed greater emphasis on the development of moral character through habit and experience. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that virtue is a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency, and that virtuous behavior is cultivated through practice and moderation. One of Aristotle's key contributions to ethical theory is his concept of eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or happiness. For Aristotle, the ultimate goal of human life is to achieve eudaimonia, which is attained by living in accordance with virtue. This idea is reminiscent of Socrates' belief that the pursuit of virtue leads to a good and fulfilling life, but Aristotle provides a more detailed account of how virtue is developed and how it leads to human flourishing. Aristotle also distinguished between intellectual virtues, such as wisdom, and moral virtues, such as courage and temperance, arguing that both types of virtues are necessary for achieving eudaimonia. Aristotle's political philosophy also reflects his engagement with Socratic and Platonic ideas. In his work Politics, Aristotle examines different forms of government and argues that the best form of government is one that promotes the common good and allows citizens to live virtuous lives. Like Plato, Aristotle was critical of Athenian democracy, but he did not advocate for rule by philosopher kings. Instead, Aristotle favored a mixed constitution, where different classes of society are represented, and where the rule of law is paramount. His more pragmatic approach to politics contrasts with Plato's idealism, reflecting Aristotle's broader emphasis on empirical observation and practical wisdom. The lasting influence of Socratic thought. The relationship between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle represents one of the most important intellectual lineages in the history of philosophy. Socrates' method of questioning, his emphasis on ethical inquiry, and his belief in the examined life provided the foundation for both Plato's idealism and Aristotle's empiricism. While Plato and Aristotle each developed their own distinct philosophical systems, they both owed a great intellectual debt to Socratic thought. The influence of Socrates on Plato and Aristotle can also be seen in their shared concern with the role of reason in human life. For all three philosophers, reason was the key to understanding the world, achieving moral virtue, and living a good life. While they differed in their views on the nature of reality and the specifics of ethical theory, they all agreed that the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom was the highest calling of human life. Socrates' influence did not end with Plato and Aristotle. Through the works of these two philosophers, Socratic ideas became central to the development of Western thought. Plato's dialogues ensured that Socrates' method of inquiry would remain a cornerstone of philosophical education, while Aristotle's more empirical approach influenced the development of science, logic, and ethics. Together, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle laid the foundation for much of Western philosophy, and their ideas continue to shape intellectual discourse to this day. In conclusion, the influence of Socratic thought on Plato and Aristotle is a testament to the enduring power of Socratic philosophy. Through Plato's dialogues, Socrates' ideas were preserved and expanded, while Aristotle's more empirical approach offered a new direction for philosophical inquiry. The intellectual legacy of Socrates, as mediated by his students, remains one of the most significant contributions to the history of philosophy, shaping the way we think about ethics, knowledge, and the nature of reality. Part 12. Socrates' enduring legacy in Western philosophy. Socrates' influence did not end with his death in 399 BCE. His philosophical contributions, methods of inquiry, and moral convictions have had a lasting impact that continues to shape Western thought today. From ancient times through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and into the modern era, Socrates' ideas have inspired countless philosophers, educators, and thinkers across disciplines. In this final section, we will explore Socrates' enduring legacy, examining how his influence has persisted through various epochs of intellectual history and how his philosophical methods and ethical principles continue to resonate in contemporary society. The legacy of the Socratic method. Perhaps Socrates' most lasting contribution to philosophy is the method of inquiry that bears his name, the Socratic method. This approach, characterized by a process of questioning and dialogue, remains a cornerstone of philosophical education. It involves engaging in dialectical discussions aimed at uncovering assumptions, clarifying concepts, and seeking definitions of ethical or philosophical ideas. The Socratic method has become especially influential in modern legal education, where it is used to train students in critical thinking and reasoning. Law professors often use the method to challenge students to think on their feet, question their assumptions, and defend their positions logically and coherently. This method emphasizes the importance of asking the right questions rather than merely providing answers, a principle that reflects Socrates' belief that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing process. In addition to its impact on legal education, the Socratic method has been adopted in various academic fields and is often used as a pedagogical tool in teaching ethics, philosophy, and critical thinking. By encouraging dialogue and inquiry, the method promotes intellectual humility and the recognition that knowledge is not simply a matter of memorization but of active engagement with ideas. The open-ended nature of Socratic questioning has influenced the structure of modern universities and the way subjects like philosophy and ethics are taught. Influence on ethical and political thought. Socrates' focus on ethics and the nature of virtue continues to shape moral philosophy. His central belief that virtue is tied to knowledge, that to know the good is to do the good, has inspired various ethical theories throughout history. This connection between wisdom and morality formed the basis for later philosophical schools such as Stoicism, which emphasized self-discipline and living in accordance with nature, and Cynicism, which advocated for a life of simplicity and rejection of material wealth. Stoicism, particularly as it developed under figures like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, drew heavily from Socratic ideas. Stoics believed, like Socrates, that virtue was the highest good and that external circumstances, wealth, status, and even physical suffering, were secondary to the cultivation of a virtuous character. The Stoics also embraced Socrates' idea that true wisdom lies in recognizing one's ignorance, encouraging a philosophy of intellectual humility and moral clarity. Socrates' influence on political thought is equally significant. His criticism of Athenian democracy and his belief in the importance of moral knowledge in governance laid the groundwork for political philosophers like Plato, who advocated for rule by philosopher kings. While Plato's political ideas were more radical than those of Socrates, the underlying Socratic conviction that political power should be grounded in virtue and wisdom has continued to resonate in debates about justice, governance, and the role of leaders. In the modern era, Socratic thought has influenced social contract theorists like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These philosophers grappled with questions about the relationship between the individual and the state, the nature of justice, and the role of law, much as Socrates had during his trial. Socrates' emphasis on the individual's responsibility to question authority and examine societal norms can be seen in Rousseau's critiques of inequality and in Locke's ideas about the consent of the governed. The martyrdom of Socrates and the model of the philosopher. Socrates' death, in many ways, cemented his legacy as a martyr for philosophy. His willingness to die for his beliefs, rather than compromise or abandon his philosophical mission, set a powerful example of intellectual courage and integrity. In Western culture, Socrates became the archetype of the philosopher, someone who pursues truth at all costs, regardless of the consequences. This ideal of the philosopher as a moral exemplar who lives in accordance with their principles has had a profound impact on subsequent thinkers. Socrates' life and death inspired philosophers throughout history to take up the mantle of truth-seeking and to challenge prevailing norms. His legacy can be seen in the lives of later figures such as the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, the Roman statesman Seneca, and early Christian thinkers like Saint Augustine. During the Renaissance, Socrates' image as a martyr for philosophy was revived by thinkers who saw in him a model of the virtuous life. Renaissance humanists, such as Erasmus and Montaigne, admired Socrates for his intellectual humility and his commitment to self-examination. They celebrated his example of living a life dedicated to wisdom and virtue, seeing it as an ideal to aspire to in their own search for moral and intellectual clarity. Socrates' willingness to question authority and challenge established norms also resonated with Enlightenment thinkers, who valued reason, critical inquiry, and individual rights. Voltaire and Immanuel Kant, for instance, drew inspiration from Socratic thought in their critiques of dogma and authoritarianism. Kant's emphasis on moral autonomy, the idea that individuals must act according to principles they can rationally endorse, can be traced back to Socratic ethics and the notion of living a life based on reason. Socrates in modern philosophy. Socrates' influence continues to be felt in modern and contemporary philosophy. His method of questioning and his focus on ethical self-examination have shaped existentialist thought, particularly in the works of philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Kierkegaard, often regarded as the father of existentialism, saw in Socrates a model of ethical subjectivity, the idea that individuals must take responsibility for their own moral choices and live authentically. For Kierkegaard, Socrates represented the ideal of the individual who remains true to their inner convictions in the face of external pressures. Nietzsche, while critical of many aspects of Western philosophy, also acknowledged the significance of Socrates as a transformative figure. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche describes Socrates as the turning point in Greek culture, marking the shift from a worldview dominated by myth and tragedy to one centered on reason and dialectic. Although Nietzsche had a complicated relationship with Socratic thought, criticizing Socrates' emphasis on reason at the expense of the instinctual and artistic, he recognized the profound impact Socrates had on the trajectory of Western intellectual history. In the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre and other existentialists embraced Socrates' emphasis on personal responsibility and the importance of questioning established norms. For Sartre, the Socratic imperative to examine one's life echoed his own existentialist belief in radical freedom, the idea that individuals are always responsible for defining the meaning and purpose of their lives through their choices. Socrates' example of living authentically, even in the face of death, inspired Sartre's vision of existential courage. Socrates in education and contemporary thought. Socrates' legacy is not confined to the realms of philosophy and ethics. His emphasis on dialogue, critical thinking, and self-examination has had a profound impact on education. The Socratic method is still widely used in classrooms to encourage active learning and intellectual engagement. In particular, law schools and philosophy departments around the world use Socratic questioning to teach students how to think critically, engage in reasoned debate, and analyze complex issues. In contemporary society, Socratic questioning has taken on a broader cultural significance. The rise of movements that encourage critical thinking, skepticism, and the examination of societal norms, whether in the realms of science, politics, or ethics, can be traced back to Socratic principles. Socrates' example of challenging authority and questioning assumptions remains relevant in today's world, where issues like social justice, environmental ethics, and political accountability are increasingly at the forefront of public discourse. Socrates' commitment to intellectual humility, the recognition that we do not possess all the answers, also resonates in an age of information overload and misinformation. His philosophy encourages individuals to remain skeptical of easy answers, to engage in dialogue, and to continually seek a deeper understanding of complex issues. This attitude is especially relevant in our modern world, where the ability to think critically and engage in productive dialogue is more important than ever. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of Socrates. Socrates' influence on Western philosophy is unparalleled. His method of questioning, his commitment to the pursuit of truth, and his ethical teachings have shaped the course of intellectual history for more than 2 millennia. Through his students, particularly Plato and Aristotle, Socrates' ideas have been transmitted and expanded, forming the foundation for much of Western thought. Yet Socrates' legacy goes beyond philosophy. He has become a symbol of intellectual courage, moral integrity, and the importance of living an examined life. His death, far from silencing his ideas, elevated him to the status of a martyr for philosophy, inspiring generations of thinkers, educators, and citizens to question authority, seek truth, and live according to their principles. In the end, Socrates' greatest contribution may not be any single philosophical doctrine, but his example of how to live a life dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom. His insistence on the importance of dialogue, self-examination, and intellectual humility remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Athens. Socrates' enduring legacy challenges each of us to engage critically with the world around us, to question our assumptions, and to strive for a life of meaning and virtue.